So far we've taken a look at a lot of the basics of OSGi. We started talking about bundles and how they're the basic unit of deployment. We then took a look at what can go inside of a bundle with components and services. We then saw how we can share features amongst our bundles using various headers within the manifest file. And we got to look at the OSGi framework itself. Now, finally, before we depart from our basics, we're going to talk about what are some of the benefits of OSGi. So let's take a look at some of those over here. So the biggest benefit that we gain from OSGi is what OSGi was designed for in the first place, this idea of modularization and this true modularization. So when we're doing development back in the old days, right, oftentimes we were stuck using WAR files or maybe even EAR files where everything was encapsulated or inside of one big file, one big WAR file. And this created issues with having our projects and applications be monolithic. We know as a monolith grows more and more and more, it becomes a little bit harder to maintain over time. So that's where modularity really helps us maintain our applications. So any sort of restrictions that we had with WAR-based development is now no longer the case. With that, there's this idea of no longer having this idea of intrusion when we're dealing with our web application restrictions, right? In other words, in regards to our design and when we're creating our applications, we have a lot more freedom as to how we want to design it. We're not stuck with either monolith or monolith. We have a lot more options made available for us. And one of the big ones is the idea of being saved from jar hell. And so let's talk a little bit more about jar hell. If you've developed web applications for any number of time or any amount of time, you may have experienced jar hell in one form or another. And jar hell is a phenomenon that occurs with class loading. So let's first talk about what class loading is. The idea here is when we're developing in the Java world, we may have specific dependencies located for specific classes. And these dependencies or classes may be within jar files. And so in order to get the dependencies, we have to go through and find the specific class we need in a specific jar file. So pretty simple idea, but things can get quite complicated over time. Right, so we have a Java class that's going to be taking care of the class loading itself. Right, every object is going to be linked to the JVM runtime through a class loader. Right, each object is working in the context of the class loader, and when we're doing our class loading, it's going to be done typically, traditionally in a hierarchical structure or tree. Right, so parent first mode. The idea here is first, when we're trying to find a class, we're going to look for the class within the parent class loader. If we can't find it, then it's going to go up the chain, right? So we start off with one parent. If it can't find it, we go to the next and then the next until we have the initial loader that checks the local context. Right, so this configuration is done based off of different vendors. The different vendors will have this done according to what they feel is the proper way. So when we're dealing with class loading, the first couple of principles with them are the following. So we have delegation, right? This is the idea that we just talked about, right? If I'm looking for a specific class, I'm going to look towards the parent, and then the parent looks towards its parent, and so on and so on, right? Visibility. This is the idea that the child class loader is able to see the parent class loader, but not the other way around. So in regards to who can see who, it's one direction, child to parent. And then when we're dealing with class loading, it's only a single class can be loaded one time. or a class can be loaded one time. All right, so let's take a look at this diagram over here. So this is the class loading that's typically done over in the Tomcat world. So we might have a specific application that we deploy, and then it's going to look for the class that it needs. So it's going to first look within what we call the common or the global class loader, right? So this is Tomcat lib ext, looking within a specific jar file there. If we can't find it there, up one level, right? Tomcat lib, and then so on and so on. If we can't find it in Tomcat, maybe it's over in the Java world, right? And so we go up the chain. So this is how class loading is classically done over in Tomcat. Right, so class loading becomes very simple when our dependencies are quite straightforward. So in this example here, we have an application, and this application has two dependencies. It has a dependency on library 1, and it also has a dependency on what we'll call library X, as we see in this diagram. So very simple, but what makes things a little bit interesting is library 1 also has a dependency on library X. So in this example, the application and library 1 both have a dependency on library X, and it has to be version number 1. So in this situation, all is fine in the world. But what if we have something like this, where we have an application that is dependent on library 1, and that same application also has a dependency on library X as well. In the previous slide, right, library 1 needs version 1 of library X. But what if something like this happens? What if library 1 has a dependency on library X, but it's specified or we're picking up the wrong version? So this is where things can get a little bit complicated, as we see. So library 1 has an issue with its dependency, and since our application depends on library 1, we're going to have a little bit of problems here. So this is just one isolated case. Now imagine if we go a little bit bigger in the next slide that we see here, where we can have a whole web application with multiple libraries, and libraries are depending on other libraries. We can then have another application depending on another library, and that library might end up over in Tomcat, or it's in the application itself. So this is where things can get even more complicated. So you can imagine, right, where dependencies are being stacked again and again and again. This can be a very cumbersome task, hence the term jar hell. Right, so what are some signs that you have reached jar hell? And it's more than just, feeling a little bit hot because of the nervousness of, well, what's going wrong. Most of the time, you're there when you have seen a couple of these exceptions, like class not found or no class def found, and so on. These are kind of the common exceptions you see when there are class loading issues or you have arrived at jar hell. So with this whole conversation of class loading and class loading errors, how exactly does OSGi help us in this whole situation? What's unique about OSGi is that every bundle has its own class loader. And so in essence, when we're doing class loading with the bundle, it's going to be handled by the OSGi container within each specific bundle. So every bundle is responsible for having its class loader all squared away, all ready to go before it's deployed or after it's deployed, whichever steps we're taking. So you'll know right away if class loading is done correctly or not as you're walking through. And we'll be experiencing a lot of this as we hit our development. Right. As we do class loading in OSGi, the class and the package visibility is explicit, and we are specifying the specific versions that we need. So there's no sort of ambiguity. Right. So what we've seen before in the previous diagram and this one here is what traditional class loading kind of looks like within a standard Java web application. So you can have your application, you can have a number of libraries within that application, and then you can go out and search for other classes or libraries within the servlet containers libraries. Like with Tomcat, we have the lib and the libext. Now with OSGi, most of our dependencies, if not all of them, are going to be residing within the OSGi container. And so each application is going to be looking for its dependencies within the OSGi container. So it makes life a little bit easier, assuming everything that we need is already there. Now there's another story of what if I want to add third-party libraries, third-party jar files. We'll hit that in another video. All right, so main big benefit is that OSGi provides a framework for modular development, and it also helps us with class loading and trying to resolve this jar hell issue. Now, you may have heard over in the Java 9 world, they came out with another framework that helps with class loading, and it's very similar to what we do over in the OSGi world. So if you are interested in that, just keep note of that. Just want to highlight that there is another framework out there that handles class loading very similar to OSGi. Now, some other benefits that we can talk about in regards to what OSGi has to offer for us. So modularity is always the big one, but the other one is also consistency. What's really nice is once we get the idea of how to develop bundles and components, it's very, very repeatable. We're able to do many different things following a very consistent pattern. And as we go through, we'll be highlighting and calling out that pattern again and again and again. All right, so these are the benefits of OSGi. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about how OSGi and Liferay kind of come together.